And indeed, this year already, we've seen one of the most defining issues playing out, which is the debt exchange program. And it has been a battle. It's been going on for weeks now, and there's no end in sight. There's been the latest extension we know, but the inclusion of individual bondholders, I guess, is the biggest threat of all. And we've seen now forcing the finance minister to ask for a meeting. Today, there was a very fruitful meeting from everybody else who was involved in it, particularly the leadership of the Individual Bondholders Forum, the Individual Bondholders Association of Ghana, and the Pensioners Individual Bondholders Forum. Three of them all sitting around the table with the finance minister to discuss the issues. And you've seen the advocacy that they've been waging for real lives that may suffer great peril if it goes ahead. And that is really defining this year going forward. The finance ministry and the government needs to close this deal so they can get an IMF executive board approval. But in doing so, there's a significant risk. And tonight, we've examined so many things when it comes to this debt exchange program. This is the first time this country is doing so. But one of the things that jumps at you, and you cannot ignore it, it is the political cost. The political cost of what is happening currently is one that myself and my team have been thinking about, and we thought, let's give it a shot. Let's try and discuss it a bit more and see, because remember that next year is an election year, and what is happening right now will define the next decade, the next generation, and the political cost will be very severe. We took a cue from a stalwart of the MPP, a cabinet minister, the man who leads the MPP in Parliament, Evans Mensah, who made some profound pronouncements in Parliament when the leadership of the individual bondholders paid him a visit. These are his words, but watch what he said from the horse's own mouth.
Nothing can substitute for discussions, roundtable discussions and engagements, wherever we find ourselves in. I think it's important that we still go back to the drawing table to have engagement with the major stakeholders. As he said, all of us are in it. And if we don't manage well, we've gone through this before, way back some 25, 30 years ago. And repositioning was a major difficulty. Today, many people are coming on board. And if this thing should happen, how do we build confidence and trust in reconstructing a new savings culture? And it's like, really, many of what we are talking about, many of these holders also belong to the middle class. And that's where the major worry is. If we are wiping away the middle class, that's going to be dangerous. That's going to be dangerous. So we need to have some further dialogue on this.
If you are wiping away the middle class, that is going to be dangerous. That, he says, will be dangerous. The middle class, that is the magic operative word here, middle class. And he drills this down so perfectly. And he says many of the bondholders, the individual bondholders, belong to the middle class. Now, why is he pointing? He's pointing at something that is critical to winning or losing an election in Ghana. The middle class typically are those people we call the floating voters. They decide this country's election. They are the kingmakers in this country. As for the core base of the two parties, the NDC and the MPP, it's set. If you put a donkey in the colors of the MPP and the NDC, that person may possibly win elections, right? It's not that they're mindless. It is just an attachment to the party that they hold on to dearly. They believe in that. You can't fault them for it. But that middle class, that floating voter, the man or woman who can read between the lines, they listen and they pay attention to what you're saying, and they float between one election to the next. They may not vote for you in the next elections, but they decide not to vote at all. And that in itself is a decision that can cost you an election. That is what JoyNews, the majority leader, is pointing at. And you cannot help but, put a bit together and try and analyze and see what he is trying to say and why he was backing an exemption for the individual bondholders, because he appreciates the political cost of wiping out that middle class. Many of them, he says, are individual bondholders. Who will decide where the pendulum swings in 2024? Now, what are the numbers we are talking about? Currently, if you go to just one of the forums, the Individual Bondholders Forum, we're talking about more than 100,000 people who have signed on to join this fight to say exempt our individual bonds. 100,000 people. I'll illustrate for you that in this country, parties have lost elections with far less number of people. This number, far less number of people have decided an election in this country. And so it is critical, 100,000. So the Individual Bondholders Forum alone can decide the next elections. I will demonstrate, going into our electoral history for you, that this number can be very critical in elections that we are approaching in the 2024 elections. But that is just one forum. Remember that there are 3 forums already. If you put their numbers together, and this is those who have registered, right? If you put their numbers together, we're talking about 1.3 million individual bondholders. That is way above what can decide an election. And as JoyNews says, many of these people are the middle class. They are the floating voters. They are the people who decide the elections, the kingmakers. So the numbers are important. Now let's look at the electoral history to tell the story. I told you about the 100,000 who have just signed on and registered on the website of the Individual Bondholders Forum, the Individual Bondholders Forum, the IBF. If you go to 2008 runoff, it was decided by 84,000 votes. In fact, it's even less than that. So those 100,000 people, and normally in the 8th year of a government, the final term of a political party in power, you tend to have runoffs. We've seen 2000, we've seen 2008. We're going to see another one, right, play out. And in those runoffs, in those 8th years, right, the last term of a party, we also tend to have runoffs. And so it's not far-fetched to assume and to predict that we possibly will have a very close race. And the 100,000 members of the Individual Bondholders Forum, led by Martin Kpebu, Thomas Menu, Franklin Kujo, etc., can decide next year's elections. JoyNews' warning exactly is that. That's what he was drilling at. And then look at that. Look at that, the margins of victory. 600,000. I mean, you look at 2016 and 2000 runoff, they are a bit of an outlier in terms of the significant margins. But then you're in the 5,000. If you look at the averages over the period, it's 500,000. And so we are talking about 1.3 million people affected, many of them middle-class voters. So we are playing with huge votes here, 1.3 million. And don't only think about this number, because these people have dependents. So you're doing a multiplier effect. You are in possibly 6 million people, if you're looking at one household of 6 people. So that clearly is a big deal. And no wonder the finance minister is beginning to say, I'm ready to change stuff, right? Because and have you heard the story about the general secretary of the party and other leaders of the NPP meeting with the finance ministry officials and the finance minister himself, asking him to reconsider? Have you heard about the majority chief whip, Anodompre himself, asking his own government to reconsider inclusion of individual bondholders? There is a lot at stake. It is the survival, the very survival of this party is at stake here. What is happening? Now, the more reason why the MPP seem to now be backed into a corner, and for the party folks, they are dead worried. JoyNews in particular has told us that. Because if you look at the nature of the MPP, they call themselves property owning They're a property-owning party. And that is why James Abungs was making the point that, listen, those people that you are playing with, that you claim you want to take their bonds away, those are the middle-class boys. Those are the people who represent, they are the very representation of the property-owning part of the population, that demographic in this. And those are the people who traditionally, the MPP say they want to appeal to because they are largely an elitist political party. In contrast, the NDC is not. It is a Congress. And if you read that very voluminous book that we brought to you the last time we covered the NDC's Congress, the party itself says they chose Congress because for them, they don't define themselves as elitist or property owning, right? They define themselves as the party that brings everybody together. You know, the wache seller, the man who cleans the toilet, the janitor, everybody comes together to form a Congress. So they are different. So they would be appealing to the masses and the villages, etc., because that's really where their base is, right? A people's party. And again, the pillars are jobs, education, social intervention, because it's a social democratic party. The NDC, the MPP hasn't got a luxury to be touching individual bondholders. I know the economy is at stake, but listen, the politics also, there are votes involved. And no wonder the story has emerged of the party's leadership in the MPP attempting to convince Kenufriata, please back off. Because next year, we're already having a tough time already convincing people in the current economic condition to vote for us. And then you're touching our core base, property owning. So James Abongsu was onto something here. And then, of course, we're trying to now put our finger on, if you're trying to look at the middle class, what is the percentage of the population that you can say are middle class? Now, if you look at the African Development Bank's 2013 report, it says in Ghana, we have 46% of Ghanaians are in that middle class area. 46% of them. If you do the permutations according to the 2021 population housing census, you're talking about 14.12 million people are, right? That is our estimate based on this. This is 2013, so let's take on the face value for a second. It could be more, it could be less, right? But if you're using the permutations against the population housing census, 14.12% million people. That is a huge number. Even if you have 1% of this, 2-5% of this affected by this current, individual bonds included in the generality of those who are holding these individual bonds, as Chairman Zabunsu warns, as a party, you are in trouble. I'm going to bring in my guest after this break. I want them to give me their own understanding of what this political cost of what is happening in Kobe. And I'm really delighted because we have a cross-section of panelists who know their stuff. Of course, you have Dr. Tio Champon, who is a political risk analyst and economist himself. So you can balance both. And then, of course, we have Dr. Kobe Mensah and Asa Sante also joining me for a conversation on this. Stay with me here on PM Express. And Dr. Tio Champon is a political risk analyst. He's obviously one who follows the economic issues very closely, and economist also. So he joins us on via Zoom. Also joining us is Dr. Kobe Mensah. He's a political communications expert, a lecturer also at the University of Ghana. Also joining me right now is Dr. Asa Sante. He's a senior political science lecturer at the University of Ghana Political Science Department, and he's also joining us with his thoughts on this. I want to start with you first of all. Dr. Tue Champon, is there any real political cost to the current direction program that is going on? If you listen to Chairman Sabongsu when he says it's dangerous to touch that middle class and possibly wipe them out, do you agree when people say, and we've seen the political party, the MPP and its executives trying to meet the finance minister to appeal to him to reconsider? Is there any real political cost to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening. A pleasure to be here. Already, given the extreme or the dire state of the economy, and given the challenges with high inflation, the cost of living, and related matters, the incumbents generally across the globe are all, losing significant ground. So if you do any public opinion survey currently, you would find that many incumbent governments, are not necessarily the most, favored in that sense. And so Ghana is not an exception. in that regard. But what makes it particularly more challenging in Ghana's case is the fact that many of the people that are pretty much sustaining and driving this economy, when it comes to savings and when it comes to investments, are also folks that you would consider being in the middle class. And here we need to be very clear on the definition of middle class. There are different definitions, but the more used one is the AFDB one that says that if you're earning between $2 and $20 a day, in current cedi terms, between 30 cedis and 300 cedis a day, then you're considered middle class. So there's actually quite a significant gap in terms of the salary range and the salary expectations. The problem is that many of those that earn within the lower half or the lower quintile of the that range normally are not people that are able to necessarily save as much or are able to invest. We call them floating middle class because they sometimes move between sometimes poverty and then coming into the middle class at the same time. So it's really a very small section that are able to actually save and subsequently buy these government instruments. The second point also is that if you look at the middle class broadly in Ghana, many of them are aspirational and they tend to most likely be people that will subscribe to the political ideology of the NPP as compared to the NDC in a sense. Therefore, the current debt restructuring exercise in the form that the government is seeking to push, should that go through, would actually leave people, as we know, worse off. And politically, when people are worse off and they're angry, of course, they will protest that with a vote. Therefore, that's why you see the likes of Chairman Sabonsu and other people within the party now saying, look, hang on, this thing, if we're not too careful, is actually going to bounce back or bite us back quite strongly. So yes, there's actually going to be a huge political consequence as a result of this restructuring exercise. Against the backdrop that remember that normally even in a second term, the incumbents don't tend to do well as much as during their first term. So you have these two factors at play here in that sense.
I mean, Dr. Kobe Champon, is the concept of the middle class being the kingmakers in Ghana's elections, is it not an exaggerated concept, or is one that it's a pretty real one?
Yeah, I suppose you meant Kobe Mensah, right?
Sorry, Dr. Kobe Mensah. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Evans, and good evening to everybody. Yes, obviously, the middle class is not exaggerated. Mostly political parties that tend to be on the center right, just like Theo actually explained, largely appeal to what we call the middle class. Why are they appealing to the middle class? Because just like you said in your analysis, these are parties which usually give freedom to the individual. And as a result, people who have dreams, who have aspirations, who see themselves as wealth makers, tend to actually be at that side of the population. And so most of the center-right political parties immediately actually connect with that particular group of people. And so rightly said in your analysis and by Theo, if you look at the character of the MPP and then the kind of people they actually connected to, certainly that's where the fault lines are going to be. I mean, if you look at coming to the elections, for example, most of the time, every political party, and per my PhD thesis, for example, I saw that in the 2000 elections, which it was about President Kufuor's elections, most political parties come into the elections with their base. All right. So the political party is coming with its activity, with its support bases, etc. And then you have the political candidate and the policy as the two connecting points to build alliances. Because most of the time, the party's character is not able to build alliances because of the ideological divide. So you build alliances or you build allies with the candidate and the policy choices that you have. So the candidate attribute is able to connect to a certain group of people who necessarily or may not necessarily be part of your ideological core. But because of the attribute of the political candidate, they are able to come to your fold and, of course, vote for you. The same with your policy. So when you look at the 2016 elections, the reason why we put Dr. Bawumia very much at the forefront of the MPP was because that was the candidate that could build those alliances or those allies for the MPP's win. And then, of course, the policy positions that the party took. So you realize that for the MPP to be able to connect to the top middle class, as Theo actually spoke about, as the floating voters, they may not necessarily be to the left or to the right. They're actually making choices based on the campaign, the reality of the campaign. Who is singing exactly the hymns that they want to hear? Who do they believe in? And immediately you are able to use this, the candidate, and then, of course, the policy to connect, they vote for you. And that's why it is very, very dicey for the MPP as at now. Now, you asked the question whether there's a political cost. I will give you a very simple formula in marketing. We call it expectation confirmation theory. Now, Theo talked about the kinds of aspirations people had, especially coming to the 2016 election. And then he said that if you do polls now, how are we going to, or what kind of response are we going to have? Now, if you look at people's expectation that they had for this particular administration, and if you look at their perceived performance, so for example, let's say expectations, perceived performance is 5, expectations was 10. If you minus the perceived performance 5 from the expectation 10, what do you get? Or if you minus the the perceived performance 5, the expectation 10 from the perceived performance 5, you get -5, all right, as the satisfaction or the dissatisfaction, which is dissatisfaction. So currently, if you ask me, it is a huge issue for the MPP administration, because at least before they came to power, we knew haircut only from the barbershop. All right. I am sure quite a lot of people did not know anything about debt restructuring, unless, of course, you were a finance student or you were a banking person. But now all these lexicons are appearing in our political system right now as we speak. That is going to be kind of a legacy based on which people are going to express their feelings towards the particular regime. So yes, huge cost. And then, of course, it depends on whether they will be able to mitigate it. But I thought that it would be difficult, because if you go back to history, President Kufuor's time, for example, the Kufuor gallons, I don't think people forgot. When he moved people from the prisons, I don't think it helped. If you look at Dumso, for example, Mahama solved it, at the later part of the 2016 election. Did they forgive him? They didn't. So you do the math.
Yeah, very interesting, fascinating stuff. Let me bring in Dr. Asa Asante, who's joined us. Doc, do you agree with that? Really grim picture if you're an MPP supporter and party executive now.
It's a difficult thing for the MPP. If you look at Ghanaian politics, go back to the history of politics in Ghana. The movers and shakers of elections. So if you do anything that antagonizes them, I'm afraid you are going to have a problem. Let's cast our mind back to the 1970s, a Champong era for that matter. You saw it was the middle class that really fought the government. Association of professional groups, Ghana Bar Association, and all that. They took the government on. So when you are in government and you have any policy that tends to ruffle the feathers of the middle class, then you are likely to be confronted with a group of people who are able to articulate what the issues are to the ordinary man. These are people that they have a lot of dependents. And these are people who always they are the people who are able to stand toe to toe and face government. All right. So problem with them, then you are likely to have a difficult task, not only in managing them, but also managing people who depend on them. And remember that in politics, one vote is so important, like the hundreds of votes that you talk, because one vote can move somebody from a candidate to become a president, a candidate to become an MP. So I thought that the PP wouldn't have taken this path, but here you are. This is born out of one thing. If you look at all the policies of the government, especially the second tenure, that issue of dialogue has been missing in the equation. As if they are running their own private business. I'm sorry to say that, but I need to be blunt about it. It's a public business. So all the time you need the vis-a-vis approach, the back and forth. You talk to people, you to have respect from there to the issues, or so that you find common ground and some of this. But that's not what we are seeing. As we are getting closer to elections, remember also that one of the votes that really influence the choices of voters is the economy. And you do within this whole block, you need to be very mindful of that. Now we are in difficult times. The economy is not performing. And you are still also having the middle class being, attacked in quote in a certain way and all that. You are working against the tide, and I'm afraid it's not going to augur well for the MPP at all. They need to sit down, plan carefully, and look at policies that will really help to deal with this problem than to resort to this type of knee-jerk, attitude to solving problems. I still can't wrap my mind around it. Because if you look at what has brought us this far, one of it, the issue of is, for instance, look at the size of government. And you guys are
goodness.
You look
unfortunately
to take care of, to undermine. I don't get it. You want to have a very comfortable life, but you want to what? Work against people who have really struggled, and they have also kept the government afloat over the years. So I don't get it. They need to really get back to the drawing board and look at some of these issues and see what they can do.
Okay. I mean, Dr. Treshampo, so I get a sense that the consensus is where the country is right now with the current debt restructuring that we're seeing, the political cost to the NPP is in significant vote lost, possibly in the 2020 elections. Does that automatically mean a gain or a win for the NDC?
Not necessarily, of course. The NDC needs to also show us what they are offering in terms of policy alternatives. Number two, also the election is another 1.5, 2 years away. So the government still has a little bit of room, but not too much, to be able to attempt to change the course around. But remember that in terms of the optics and the politics, it was the same administration that touted itself as being, quote unquote, competent managers of the economy, that we saw a series of, public lectures here and there in the lead up to the 2016 election, particularly when there were, serious economic challenges with the economy, doomsday, etc. So basically, they pitched themselves as being able to manage the macro situation much better than others. But number two, to the point that we're able to safeguard your investments and safeguard your savings. And what we've seen in the last couple of years really is that that hasn't materially actually played out. And it's not just even the issue of the debt restructuring, but if you're talking of inflation in excess of 50 something percent, almost, we haven't seen this in over 2 decades, right? We're talking about other issues. And remember that the MPP, um, attempted to restructure or clean up the financial sector. Obviously, also because of the political consequences associated with that in trying to safeguard middle class savings and middle class investments. And then Dr. Asar Santi made a very important point that these are not just ordinary middle class folks like you and I. On average, you have about everyone supporting between 3 and 5 people extra, just the way of our social system is set up here. So if I'm going to be losing my source of livelihood, one, and number two, the economy is further going to bite me, then of course I would show or protest that in terms of vote. But like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that people would automatically switch into voting for the NDC. You might see some of them actually staying out and not voting, at all. Reference being what happened with the MPP in 2008. If you recall, at the latter part of 2008, oil prices had started coming down, and people, were saying, President Kufuor reduced price of petrol. All of those things never happened. It was actually, if I recall, just 2 weeks to the election before prices started coming down, and people never forgave the MPP then for it. Certainly, in my household or some people that I lived with around the time at Dansoman, they just didn't vote, right? They didn't see themselves going to voting for the NPP, the NDC, the alternative, but then they stood out. So you're likely to see more sort of apathy in that sense, rather than them, voting for the opposition. But the game is squarely in the hands of the NDC to also show Ghanaians what sort of other policy alternatives and approaches they would, provide to address the problems here.
Um, Dr. Kobe Mensah, so what does the MPP do here? Do you get a sense that the party actually even appreciates the gravity of the situation on their hands, considering where they are right now? And do they really have a way to mitigate what you've just prescribed could happen next year?
Yeah, thank you. I think that honestly, I think the cost actually goes beyond even the elections. It is not about losing votes. It's about the brand credibility of the NPP, the what we call the brand equity as the party that manages or can manage better the economy. I don't think that description actually fits again because from what we have seen, and as Theo actually pointed out, you promised that you are the better managers of the economy. The party has kind of prided itself for so long. Now, that particular equity has dissipated. All right. Again, we're talking about legacy. The legacy of Nanado, for example, has actually been hugely affected. All right. So it's not only about losing votes, but these other political ramifications are clear. And to resolve it, as you said, is not a one-day job. I mean, it would be difficult for you to say that you could actually convince the Ghanaians by taking some raft measures that people would perceive as short-term. You have to be mindful of how people would perceive what you do. I think that, as you said, or as you asked, what must they do first? They have to be remorseful. They haven't shown any remorse. Continually, people say the president and the finance minister have not shown any iota of evidences that suggest that they themselves are actually taking the hard decisions. A lot more people have called for the president to cut down waste. They haven't done that. And we haven't seen any speech, or we haven't heard any speeches that suggest that the party or the government is actually remorseful in what is happening. We haven't seen that they are demonstrating that they are in it with us, that we all are in it together. You don't see it. I mean, in the UK, for example, you hear prime ministers telling you what they're doing, actually, sort of empathizing with people. We don't find any words of empathy, from our leaders. I haven't actually heard that. All that we hear is castigations here and there. If you don't want to vote for me, you can vote for the other parties. That wouldn't help. So I think that the only way that they could actually, kind of get back to us for people to think that, well, we can give them some kind of a pass is for them to first demonstrate that, yes, we have wronged, in a number of ways. We have taken quite a number of policy positions or actions that did not augur well, and so therefore they are remorseful for that. And then, of course, begin to be transparent and be very frank with Ghanaians, and perhaps we could actually, pardon them. But I think that the cost to the political party itself is huge. And of course, going into the elections also, as I said, you would have your policy and you have your candidate, not only the party. Is it possible that you could bring other candidates that perhaps Ghanaians will find as trustworthy, or Ghanaians would see as competent, for example? Maybe you could do that. But of course, the promises, I don't think, that are actually contained in policies, I think it will do very little to sort of appease people, because already the credibility is gone. All right. We've heard tons and tons of promises that have just dissipated in terms of performance. So policy promises, I doubt it, but perhaps personalities, maybe they could actually do the trick.
I mean, I want to quickly isolate the elephant in the room, and I want to quickly bring in Dr. Chicham before I go back to Dr. Santan, because obviously of your economic background as well to this. The inclusion of the individual bondholders who were initially excluded, could that prove to be the final nail in the coffin? And I wonder, political economic wise, was it a smart move to do, if indeed we've analyzed and say that really is your core base?
Remember that initially they were not part, and it was only after the pensioners or the pension funds were excluded that the government now had to find a way of bringing somebody else, right, into the game. In other words, more like a zero-sum, a game here. And the individual bondholders are a lot. I think there was a bit of a miscalculation on the part of the government in thinking that these guys would struggle to mobilize and would struggle then to actually, give them the pushback that we're seeing currently. Because under the terms of most of these sovereign debt restructurings, you need what is called a qualifying majority, typically about 75%, right? Where if 75% of the bondholders say that we accept the new restructuring terms that are being offered to us, it then applies to the other 25% or the minority guys. As we speak currently, the government is struggling to reach that, target. Hence why we already have seen the extension happening 3 times, right? Already, and likely to even be extended much further. And that is because they did not take into account, right, the fact that a lot of the individual bondholders could actually mobilize quite quickly. But the story in there also is that, or what it tells me really, is that these middle class or individual bondholders, if they can mobilize this quickly against the proposed debt exchange, then they can also mobilize very quickly in actually voting a government out because they have been impoverished and been made much worse off than that. So it was a big political, in my view, miscalculation. And therefore, hence why you see the Ministry of Finance trying to sit down with them and others to sort of reach some consensus or compromise. But however you slice and dice it, because there are implied losses and implied haircuts with the debt exchange program, some of them would still decide politically either to vote the government out or just remain apathetic and therefore not vote at all. That's the reality.
Very interesting indeed. So the political miscalculation there. I mean, Dr. Sasante, so the NDC, the MPP is where it is today. That's the reality. They've already included the individual bonds. I mean, the conversations are happening already in this. All of you have analyzed that if this continues, the MPP stands to lose the most. And that could translate into votes. The party, though, what should the party be doing? Because the party, of course, the government has to run the affairs of state. But then there's a political party that will prosecute the elections next year. Already, we've been reading today that the General Secretary and other leaders of the party have already been to try and speak to the Finance Minister to try and convince him to, back off, especially with the inclusion of the individual bonds. How should the party be approaching this going forward?
As for the president, he's leaving office after the elections. Highest point we are talking about 2024, 7 January, is off. So it is incumbent on the MPP party itself to call the government to order. That look, you are going to make things difficult for us. Look at some of these issues and address it head on, the better, right? They can't just be sitting down, folding their arms and get things deteriorated. Otherwise, campaign is going to be difficult for them. How are they going to campaign? Let us remember that for elections, critical components you are talking about ideas, referendum of your work as well. What work, what legacy? If this thing continues, I'm afraid you are not going to have, because now all hands are expected to be on deck to be able to support the government to build the economy back so that you win the confidence of the people. That's the most important variable. Then development, which is critical to voters in this country. You are not going to satisfy that. All right. Once you get that one also wrong, issue of unemployment and other, benefits will prove from a healthy economy. You are not going to need the building for message we develop around these ones and churn out against the party. So it is incumbent upon the party to rise up to the occasion, tell the government that, look, let's look at it this way, and then begin to get closer to government and advise government every step that they take, they are close. Otherwise, campaigning for them. Two, now you realize that the party's credibility is waning by the day. All right. The government has what? Credibility crisis now.
Okay, we lost him there, unfortunately. Dr. Chichambo, if you can end this point for me about the party in all this. You have any sympathies for it? I get a sense that you're caught between a rock and a hard place in all this, because eventually they are the ultimate. They ultimately will have to bear the burden. They will prosecute the agenda.
Yeah, yes, but it also shows you the weakness in our sort of governance or political structures, right? Where the party itself, as an institution, normally when they get into power, are not necessarily able to call the leadership. So what I mean by that, the president, the ministers, other things into account when things are not going too well. largely because the way the politics runs here, and the political scientists can speak to this better than I, it tends to be driven by personalities. And these people tend to really be the ones that finance the campaigns of the parties. So the parties themselves are just electoral winning vehicles or machines rather than, as an avenue to do serious policy work and diagnosis prior to coming to power. So the MPP party is in a very difficult place, as Dr. Sante and my good friend Kobe have highlighted, that there is a real serious issue of not just policy credibility, but even political credibility, in the sense that none of the things that they're promising or have even promised have fully materialized. So it becomes extremely then difficult to now come to Ghanaians again to say, look, guys, I'm going to deal with inflation, I'm going to deal with CD, I'm going to deal with all those, other issues, because they're going to ask you, well, what's the evidence or what's the proof of that, given the most, recent performance? So yes, very, very tough times.
Yeah, I mean, same point to you, Dr. Kobe Mensah, about what the party can do in this case.
Well, in every election, of course, the dynamics. I always say that it boils down to strategy. Of course, the campaign itself matters. The campaign has a huge effect. I remember there's a story about SPO in Austria where the party was actually in a very scandalous position. What they did is brought one very decent person that you would say, the right person, the wrong party, and they ran the entire campaign around him because everybody knew that that candidate was the most sternest person, the most disciplined person, and they won the election. So what the party can do, I think that you would want to look at the armory that you have. You have the political party, you have the policy, you have the presidential candidate. Obviously, what I call political brand architecture, the accessing the elements that you have, which ones can connect to voters for them to believe in the campaign. And so it is up to them to look at their arsenals and see what they can do to salvage the situation. But it's a very tough one, indeed.
Okay. Do I get a sense that this is not salvageable?
No, it is. For me, I always say that I don't write off any political, campaign. It boils down to strategy. Strategy from you, strategy from your opposing camp. So if the MPP could find the most optimum, compelling level of strategy, and to find NDC as a very lousy opposition, they can win the election, despite all that is happening. But I don't think that NDC will be taking it lying down. Of course, at the moment, they're in the pole position, don't forget, because there's no way you could say that MPP still has an upper hand. It doesn't. Currently, as we speak, the NDC is in the pole position, but they've got to do a lot of work as well in order that they can actually kill it and kill it absolutely well. But of course, that also means that the MPP can strategize and still win the election if they combine their elements appropriately. So I think that I wouldn't say that it is off their hands. No, it boils down to strategy from both camps.
Okay, final thought to you, Dr. Tio Champon. Is this salvageable, and what would it take?
Definitely salvageable. We still have a year and a half to go in politics. A month or a day is a long time. It depends on the state of the economy. 2023, 24 will all be about the economy, and it also depends on what candidates both parties actually present in that sense. Because I think on the policy factor, none of the two parties can really claim any major victory on the policy grounds, because at least the record is there for us all to see. So the candidate choice would actually be quite interesting in all of it. And then also how the economy performs this year going into next year will be a really crucial point to note as well.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm grateful that you joined me. Enjoy the rest of your evening.